conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Welcome to California State University of San Bernardino Conversations on Race and Policing, a series that began in 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd. Series organizers are Matt Patino, Crafton Hills College Instructor of History, formerly of the Balto Police Department, Dr. Mary Texeira, CSUSB Professor Emerita of Sociology, formerly of the LA Sheriff's Department, Amber Broaden, Adjunct Professor of Psychology at CSUSB and CSU Dominguez Hills, Stan Futch of the Westside Action Group, retired from the Riverside Fire Department, Robie Madrigal, the Public Affairs Communications Specialist in the Pfau Library, Jeremy Murray of the CSUSB History Department, and Thin Lee, who makes it all possible. I'm Mike German, Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and former Special Agent of the FBI. I'll start by reading the CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the California State University, San Bernardino, more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you. Today we are joined by Dr. Simon Balto. He is the author and multi-award-winning, the author of the multi-award-winning Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power. He's a regular contributor to The Guardian and has written for several scholarly and popular publications, including Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The Baffler, The Progressive, The Journal of American History, The Journal of African American History, Journal of Urban History, American Quarterly, and Labor, among others. He has appeared in media for live interviews with BBC World News, CNBC, and Al Jazeera, as well as dozens of interviews for print pieces published around the world. He currently teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, his alma mater, previously working at the University of Iowa and at Ball State University. He's the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and most recently the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Balto, welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody who's involved in the planning of this, the execution of this, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to keep things fairly informal. I want to talk for those who don't know. I just want to talk a bit about where my current work stands relative to some of the things that I have done in the past, and so. For folks who don't know my previous work, so my first book, Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power, was really an examination of how, from really beginning in the 19-teens, when Chicago begins to absorb a really substantial Black population as a consequence of the first Great Migration, how between that juncture and really the fall of Black Power, the crushing of Black Power at the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, how over the span of that time, Chicago's police department cultivated such a adversarial and hostile relationship to its Black communities. That book took me in a number of different directions. I think that partly because it landed in 2019, once once the murder of George Floyd happened in 2020, and the United States experienced the largest protest movement in American history, a lot of the attention that the book generated focused on the really repressive aspects of the police unit as it pertained to Black folks. And I think that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense for a couple of different reasons. It makes sense because within the context of the summer of 2020 and beyond, there was a renewed focus on police abuse, police violence, police harassment, racial profiling, and so on and so forth. And the other reason that beyond that specific context, that it made sense that people were paying attention to those aspects of the book is that really was a lot of the focus of the book. When I was, I entered into the research for the book, not knowing what I was going to find, but a lot of what I ended up focusing on were these instances of abuse and things like that, because that was where a lot of the evidentiary trail took me when I was doing archival research. So you have a lot of Black individuals and organizations in Chicago, especially starting in the mid 20th century, who are constantly, suing the police department, criticizing the police department, writing op-eds about the police department, and really focusing very heavily on matters of abuse, racism, harassment, etc. And I don't have any regrets about those focuses. I think that they were important, and I think that they were very illustrative of some of the larger problems that pervade the system, that pervade the criminal legal system, especially in terms of how it relates to communities of color. But the basic framework for the book, like beginning in the introduction, talked about how, and this is again cribbed from a source, a Black police officer working in the Chicago Police Department in the 1970s named Howard Saffold, where he talked about how in his formulation, Black populations in Chicago were both, quote, over-policed or over-patrolled and underprotected. And so a lot of what the book focused on was the over-patrolling aspect of that. And again, that's sort of what a lot of what the audience reception focused on too. But the other piece of the puzzle is that underprotected piece. And that comes through in a couple of different places in occupied territory. And that's really where I'm trying to think about when it comes to this project that I'm working on right now. So in terms of occupied territory, when we're talking about like the underprotected part, I'll just give two examples. So in the late 19-teens, not really culminating with the 1919 race riot in Chicago, but the 1919 race riot sort of serving as a crescendo moment in this history of violence. But as Black people are moving to Chicago in droves in the late 19-teens, they're experiencing just constant violence from white Chicagoans. So dozens and dozens of Black businesses, Black homes are getting bombed, Black people are being threatened, Black people are being harassed. And Black people invoking their citizenship rights expect the Chicago Police Department to do something to protect them from white terrorism. And the police department just doesn't. That over the course of this, there's a particularly acute 4-year arc from 1917 to 1921, where this problem is particularly bad. And in the midst of dozens and dozens of bombings, the Chicago Police Department makes exactly one arrest in connection to any of these acts of terrorism. And the problem gets so bad that the NAACP, the local NAACP, begins exploring hiring its own investigators to try to figure out who is responsible for these crimes, which, although they don't explicitly tie it to the failures of the police department, that's what it amounts to, right? I mean, it's a tacit admission. Like if people are having to hire their own private investigators to investigate acts of racial terrorism, that is a tacit admission that the police department is not doing anything about these acts of racial terrorism. And so that was really where I first began to encounter this history, at least in terms of the chronology of how the book is arranged. But it comes across even more so, again, over housing disputes in the 1940s and the 1950s. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, Chicago is again in the midst of a massive influx of Black people coming in from the South as part of the Second Great Migration. So hundreds of thousands of new Black folks are arriving in the city. And they are experiencing again, extraordinary amounts of racial terrorism. They're experiencing violence in the parks, violence in their homes, violence in their workplaces, violence in schools. And what happens there is that there are some instances where the police department does dispatch officers to try to prevent this racial violence from taking place. However, multiple police administrators end up taking the political position publicly, and they say this unabashedly, that they wish that these efforts by Black folks to integrate the city of Chicago would stop, because it is sapping resources from the police department to focus on more, for lack of a better word, in their imagination, more legitimate reasons for the police to be dispatched, right? So their basic premise is that by drawing police attention to protect Black people from white violence when Black people are trying to just do the basic act of moving into a home, the police department's position becomes that it is simply not worth it for them to continue to try to protect people who are integrating into white neighborhoods, because they need to focus on more, quote unquote, legitimate police action. And so you do have in that moment, again, like police administrators, and again, this is not an officer level thing, this is an administrative thing. Them creating a taxonomy, if you will, of like police priorities, of which Black life and safety in the face of white violence exists, if not fully at the bottom, then certainly nowhere near the top. And so when I was thinking about these stories, those really stuck with me after I got done with the book, and I was thinking about what I was going to do for the next project, and I'm going to have other stuff I'm working on too. I also have a book that I'm working on about Fred Hampton, but I was thinking about these stories, and I was thinking about what exactly it is that these systems are supposed to do and what it is that they do. And so this project that I'm turning to now is thinking about what the police system and the broader criminal legal system, not only what they can do to people, but what they do not do for people. And so the book that I'm working on right now is it's a history of racial violence in the United States, really racial violence in the making of the American story, kind of from the end of the Civil War up until the rights revolutions of the 1960s, and really looks at how white violence, white terrorism against communities of color, by which I do not only mean Black communities, by which I also mean Mexican American communities, by which I mean Asian American communities, by which I mean Native communities, how racial violence is embedded in the story of the making of America during this period, but also about how the legal systems, including but not exclusive to the police, are involved and embedded within that story. So, like one of the examples that I think about a lot, one of the examples that I'm writing about in the book, takes place at the border. It takes place in particular in 1918, and it involves a really small. You can call it a town. It's a small town of less than 200 people, known as Porvenir, along the Texas-Mexico border. And the population of the town, except for like one or two people, it's all people who are either Mexican American or who are Mexican nationals who are simply living on the Texas side of the Rio Grande. And during this time period in 1918, the border is pretty awash in instability, right? I mean, the Mexican Revolution is happening. There's a lot that's happening during this time, and in this pretty remote, desolate area of South Texas or West Texas, there is a lot of dispute over land that is happening between members of this small town and local white ranchers. And without getting into all of the details, one night in 1918, some of these white ranchers, alongside a company of members of the Texas Rangers, who are, again, a state police agency, they ride into this town of Porvenir under the cover of darkness. They pull all of the able-bodied men out of town. They line them up and they shoot them execution style. And their intentions are very explicitly expulsionist. They want people gone. They want the town of Porvenir gone. It's also extractive in that they have a desire to claim the land that people in Porvenir have been working. And the thing is that it works. I mean, that the people. So when all of the able-bodied men are murdered in this fashion, their survivors, panicked, of course, like gather the bodies of their loved ones, and they go to Mexico, leaving behind many valuable belongings, land, crops, livestock, that is eventually claimed by white ranchers. And so I think about this a lot because I think about, I as part of like working on this chapter, I read about the Texas Rangers and, about how this is a police agency that's nominally founded to prevent, murder and plunder. And like, what do we do with these systems when those that are designed to ward off murder and plunder end up themselves becoming the murderers and end up becoming the plunderers? And so I'm trying to wrestle with these ideas of like, so many people think about what it is that that these systems, these institutions, these agencies do to people. And I guess in the case of Porvenir, that is something that they are doing to people. But it is also a case in which the Rangers, theoretically, were it not an institution pretty awash in white supremacy at this point, at that particular juncture in time, but theoretically, the Rangers exist to try to prevent a sort of massacre like what happened at Porvenir from happening. But of course, they not only don't prevent it, they are the most active participants in it. And that's just one of countless examples that I'm wrestling with when it comes to this story of like how do we make sense of it? How do we process the claims of purpose of these institutions in juxtaposition to sort of the realities of what the benefits that they sort of end up actually offering to people in these moments of crisis, right? And I'm thinking here very specifically, like I'm not talking about intracommunal violence or anything like that. I'm specifically talking about in instances of when the rubber meets the road of like whiteness and white violence exercising its most violent tendencies towards communities of color. What exactly is it that these institutions do? And it's what I'm finding like over and over and over again is that these institutions let communities of color down. And perhaps that just makes sense within the larger schema of American race and racism. But it is sort of just, were it not so revolting, it would be almost numbing how just like constant this story repeats itself. Whenever I'm like finding new case studies, I'm like, okay, well, what happened here within the confines of the legal system? And it's just like, this is taking me obviously into areas of lynching and all these different places too, but Anyway, I hope I've made my point, and I'll stop there because I could talk for the entirety of the next 40 minutes about this.
Thank you. Wow, a lot of different directions to go. I do have a question. You mentioned that the Red Summer of 1919 was the crescendo moment, and you mentioned that it's
Yeah.
more of a 4-year window between 1917 and 21. We'd already seen African American migration to the North beginning in the late 19th century. And I think as historians, US historians, we kind of focus on 1919 and coincide the violence with the return of white veterans from the First World War. Can you kind of expand on that? And, obviously it wasn't just the veterans that precipitated this violence.
Yeah, well, in Chicago, it's like veterans are not even the ones most responsible for the violence. It's actually white youth, white youth gangs, especially, who are responsible for some of the most vicious anti-Black violence in Chicago. I mean, Chicago is an interest. I mean, this is also true of DC, but just focusing here on Chicago, I mean, like Chicago is an interesting case study because I mean, there's a pretty serious story of Black armed self-defense within the confines of 1919 in Chicago too. But in terms of the violence that was authored by white people within the context of 1919, it was primarily, to the extent that it was documented at the time, a lot of it was authored by these white youth gangs, including a gang that variously was called the Hamburg Club. Sometimes they went by the Hamburgers or something like that. But that included a young man named Richard Daley, who would go on to become the boss of Chicago, and the kingmaker, and eventually the king of Chicago. And he was very active in this club in 1919, and to his dying day, he refused to say what, if anything, he did during that summer of 1919. So I think to the extent that the story of veterans comes into play within the story, at least of Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919, it's actually when it comes to Black veterans. Black veterans being some of the most prominent faces of armed self-defense. I forget the exact statistics, but the majority of people who are killed in this quote unquote riot were Black. But there were some white people killed as well. And a lot of that story, I mean, it was not like Black folks were marauding through white neighborhoods in the way that white people were marauding through Black neighborhoods. It was that Black veterans who obviously had arms training in the military and had guns, defended their home, defended their families, defended their properties. And so I don't know if there's a big story of white veterans. Again, this is just in Chicago. I don't know if there's a big story of white veterans participating much in the story of the riot, but there's a pretty important story of Black veterans. And then in terms of the larger arc of things, it is absolutely true that, so when the Great Migration in Chicago begins in the middle of the 19-teens, Chicago already has tens of thousands of Black people, right? I mean, there have been Black folks moving there for quite some time, to your point, Matt. But they were so severely segregated into pretty narrow pockets of the South Side that I think that there was simply less violence because there was just less interracial. They weren't perceived as a threat in the way, like a threat to the sort of white social order in the way that they began to become as the numbers picked up so rapidly during the first Great Migration, and because the capacities of traditional Black neighborhoods to absorb that many people buckled and broke. Eventually, Black folks need to find new places to live, and the places that they need to find, the places where they go, are traditionally white neighborhoods, and that's when the violence begins. So it's not to say that being Black in Chicago in, say, 1909 was somehow like a picnic, but it is to say that that I think Black folks did not experience white violence in the same way at that point, just because white folks weren't as didn't feel the same sort of fury and threat about sort of integration and job competition and those sorts of things.
So is it a I can't think of a better word, so I'll just use it. Is it this perceived encroachment? Because I'm thinking this is the same time period, excuse me, of the Tulsa riots,
Mhm.
Porvenir, as you mentioned. I mean, this is something that's happening within the same time period in the late 19 teens and the beginning of the 20s. We're also seeing the reemergence of the Klan and
Mhm.
other vigilante groups. Is that what's happening? Is it not to
Uh,
simplify it too much, but you're not staying in your place kind of thing?
I don't think it's in Chicago at least. I mean, there's some interesting Klan stories in Chicago, especially as relates to the police department. But those actually come later. I mean, I could talk about those if people want.
Yeah.
There's some wild stories from the '60s actually related to the Klan in Chicago. Um, in this particular moment, the Klan's not really, at least as far as I've been able to tell, not really that operative in Chicago at this point
Mhm.
in time. I mean, I know that, like, I mean, you're right that like during the 1920s, it's the Klan is experiencing this huge resurgence, and of course they're super anti-black. They're also, at in their 1920s iteration, they're also really anti-Catholic. They're
Mhm.
also sort of, I mean, I guess it maybe is part of their like anti-Catholic stuff. They're also just weirdly obsessed with like enforcing prohibition in certain parts of the
Yeah.
country. They're just like they have like a really like a hodgepodge of things that they're angry about. But in Chicago, I don't think we can lay this at the feet of the Klan.
Okay.
I think it really is much more, and I think that there certainly is an element of like sort of just the basic like white supremacist logic of like stay in your place. But I
Yeah.
think it really is probably best understood as a matter of like um, there is some element of resource allocation, right? I mean that
Mhm.
Chicago's like industrial landscape at this time is really fraught, and by which I mean that the stockyards were pretty infamous for trying to break strikes amongst white workers by bringing in black strike breakers, and that obviously, black workers are not being allowed into the white unions, and so this is their opportunity to get jobs, and so you have all these variables by which white workers are getting increasingly angry at black strike breakers, and that leads to some violence. And then you have, and that's a bit of an oversimplification because there are efforts to do interracial organizing, but that
Mhm.
interracial organizing oftentimes breaks down. Um, but also, it is in many ways, to the extent that it's about stay in your place, I think that that is meant in many ways quite literally in terms of just stay out of our neighborhoods.
Mhm.
So much of the violence that cascades upon Chicago during this time period, and honestly also in the 1940s and 1950s, if you were to lay it out on a map, it happens along the margins of black and white neighborhoods, right? It happens when what had traditionally been a white neighborhood all of a sudden has like a dot of black population on it, and that's when the bombs begin to start, right? Is like people are trying to preserve the racial um, homogeneity of their neighborhoods.
I would like to go forward just a little bit in time. A couple of weeks
Sure.
ago, Dr. Madeline Hamlin was here, and she
Oh,
touches
nice.
on, yeah, she does, she did touched on the way Chicago policed the projects and the Chicago
Hmm.
PD, not Chicago's housing police. It was Chicago PD doing this.
Yeah.
And it almost like something's in the water because we see the way Chicago PD treats the projects, especially among African Americans. Let's fast forward to 1968. We see the way Bobby Seale was singled out in the Chicago 8 trial. We see what happened to Fred Hampton. Is this just endemic?
Um, I mean, as a historian, I'm sort of trained to think about change over time.
Uh-huh.
um,
Yeah.
so That's a good question. I mean, so Madeline and I have talked about this. We haven't talked about this exact question, but we've talked quite a bit about our respective projects. Um, I think that by the time you get to the 1960s, it absolutely is endemic.
Okay.
Um, I think it took a while to get there. And one of the interesting things, it's sort of it's a bizarre um, coincidence that it has gotten so bad by the end of the 1960s because the 1960s were from 1960 to 1967. CPD was overseen by a man named Orlando Wilson, so he was the superintendent, and he was, by all accounts, like for that time, like a pretty he was a reformer. I mean, I don't think he would have necessarily identified himself as like a progressive reformer, but he was someone who was really interested in reforming the police department in ways that would make it work better, that would try to increase transparency, that would increase efficiency. Um, and one of the things that he really was trying to do was to make the police department less brutal, less racist, less violent, at least on its face. Um, and so you have, on the one hand, him trying to do all of these various things that might make the department something that was less, trying to diminish the escalating adversarial relationship that had been heightening by the end of the 1950s between the Black community and CPD. But he also he like literally wrote textbooks that were adopted in criminology classrooms all across the country about police work. And I mean, like he was constantly doing scientific analyses and like all these different things to try to figure out what the most efficient way to go about policing a city was. And so while on the one hand he's trying to like rein in police violence to increase transparency and all these things, he also is doing things like trying to formalize stop and frisk. He's doing things like trying to do like rapid response that saturates like certain quote unquote high risk neighborhoods
Mm-hmm.
with heavy police presences, and like the high risk neighborhoods inevitably end up being Black neighborhoods. And so you have like, I think on the one hand this history of like good intentions, and then on the other hand like actual results. And so by the time he leaves office in 1967, he's done things that I think a lot of, especially members of the Black middle class, think are like kind of positives for the city, but that especially members of the Black working class and the Black poor are experiencing is like even heavier repression than what they were experiencing before that. And then when he leaves office, he was like, he was kind of, he was, one of the things that he was best known for was that he was sort of independent from Daley in a way that almost no other police official ever had been. And so when he leaves office, and there were rumors that Daley finally just kind of pushed him out, when Wilson leaves office in 67, he's replaced by a Daley sycophant. And so all of the kind of repressive elements that Wilson had helped to implement and formalize continue, and all the guardrails that he had tried to put in place in terms of like, in terms of accountability mechanisms and all those sorts of things, those all fall away. So all of the things that had been escalating tensions with the community persist, and all of the things that have been trying to rein in police abuse, those go away. And so it's basically a perfect storm. So like by 1968, when the Chicago 8 trial is happening, but also when Chicago, like hundreds of other places across the country, goes up in flames in April after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, everything, like the police department, like Daley and the sycophant who comes in after Wilson, his name is Jim Conlist. Daley and Conlist just unleashed the police department on Black Chicago, especially that April. And in the aftermath of the King uprisings in Chicago that month, it's discovered that I mean, this is also for people who don't know. I mean, there's Daley is mad in the wake of these uprisings in 1968. Daley is mad that the police department didn't do more to harm people who were out in the streets. So he issues he hauls Conlisk into his office and berates him for like the police department not being violent enough against people who are out in the streets, you know, breaking store windows and stuff like that. And Daley famously tells the press that he, in this closed door meeting, he told Conlisk that he wants the police department to quote, shoot to maim any looters and shoot to kill any arsonists. And that's what Conlisk encourages his men to do after Daley tells him to do this. But there's also evidence that emerges in 1968 in the wake of these events, that the police department was also going through and just executing Black men like execution style, like shooting them in the head during the rebellions. And so, I mean, like basically by the period of time that Dr. Hamlin is talking about, I think it is safe to say that violence and just extreme racism were pretty endemic within the police department. And I think that is really a story that it doesn't begin in 1960, but I think it really solidifies during the 1960s.
So as a 21st century student, I think the question that comes to mind, this has to have caught the attention of the feds at some point, right? The civil rights violations?
No, not really. Not that I know of. I mean, it caught the attention of it catches the attention of the feds when people protest against police violence. I mean, that's the story of what happens to Fred Hampton, right? I mean that, like the story of what happens to Fred Hampton is particularly egregious. But if you were to go look, so the Chicago Police Department's Red Squad files, which are basically their, it starts in the early 20th century, and it's basically their quote unquote anti-subversive unit, basically surveilling, infiltrating any sort of leftist organizations. Mm-hmm. The Red Squad's files still miraculously exist thanks to the dogged work of civil liberties organizations and archivists at the Chicago History Museum. But if you go look at them, you can go look through kind of like a variety of different left-leaning organizations and individuals, look through their files from the late 1960s, and you will see some stuff in there that is communication from federal officials with Chicago Police Department officials. But it's all about trying to find further ways to repress these leftist movements. It's not about like trying to figure out why CPD is murdering people, right? And so the coordinated assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in December of 1969, coordinated between the FBI, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and the Chicago Police Department. To my knowledge, that's the extent of federal investigation into what was happening in Chicago. I think even in the wake of the infamous 1968 DNC riot in August of '68, I don't even know if the FBI did any investigative work at that point. Mm-hmm. Maybe, but it wasn't something that I necessarily looked at, but yeah, not to the best of my knowledge.
Can you talk a little bit more about Fred Hampton? Sure. You mentioned my reading suggested that the FBI saw Fred Hampton as, they referred to him as the Black Messiah, which was going to endanger basically the status quo. So is that why he was on their radar? Is that why he was on Cook County's radar?
I think that, one thing that I would say especially to anybody who ends up, watching this or listening to this, who's, a student or a young person. I think it's worth emphasizing that when the FBI and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and the CPD began targeting Fred Hampton for surveillance and eventually assassination, he was 20 years old. When he was murdered, he was 21. And I think it says a lot about the state of paranoia that exists within these institutions, at least at the time, about the possibilities of what Fred Hampton and others within his orbit were trying to cultivate in Chicago, in terms of like trying to build something that would actually challenge in a meaningful way the status quo that had prevailed in Chicago for many years at this point. So, so as a member, like my suspicion, and I don't know that this is like, these are counterfactuals because we can't talk about, we can't say definitively, we can't comment definitively on what didn't happen, right? We can only sort of talk about what did. But my suspicion is that had Fred Hampton only been like sort of sticking to sort of revolutionary language, and if that was confined to just working with other people within the Black Panther Party, that maybe the radar would not have gone off so strongly for members of like local, state, and federal law enforcement. I think that what really alarmed them to the point of murder was the fact that, contrary to the popular image that a lot of people have about the Black Panther Party, at least in Chicago, Fred Hampton and the Panthers were dedicated to cross-racial organizing amongst the poor across the city of Chicago, trying to build an immense political coalition that was not just Black folks, but that was also Puerto Ricans. This is where the alliance between the Black Panthers and the Young Lords comes in, but also amongst the vast population of poor white people living in Chicago. This is especially true of so Chicago at this point in time was the home to a lot of white migrants coming in from Appalachia, who were basically coming to Chicago, leaving dirt poverty in Appalachia in the hopes of finding something better in Chicago, and also experiencing grinding poverty in Chicago. And so part of what Hampton and others were doing within the city was trying to like connect the dots between all of these people, and basically saying, okay, well, so it might appear on face value that like, a young Black kid from the South Side of Chicago might not have that much in common with a young white dude, flying a Confederate flag, who comes in from Appalachia, who lives on the north side of Chicago. But what Hampton was trying to do was to bring them together and say, well, okay, you're both poor as hell. You both experience extreme police harassment as a result of your social position. Like, even if Black people experience it differently, even if Puerto Rican people experience it differently than white people do, like, the evidence is pretty rampant that, that poor white people living in Uptown in Chicago were getting harassed constantly by police as well. And, just lacking basic social services. And so what Hampton was trying to do was to bring all of these people together in a way that would launch a full-throated challenge to the Democratic Party, to the Daily Machine, to the broader status quo of American society as it existed, and basically proposing to try to overthrow the system of capitalism and the way that it governed people's lives. And so it was through this, they called it the Rainbow Coalition. And again, I think that was particularly alarming for members of these state institutions. And I think, just to put a pin in it, I think also one of the things that the FBI tried to do to Fred Hampton was to get some of the black street gangs in Chicago to assassinate him. So they manufactured letters back and forth, basically trying to instigate warfare between the Panthers and the Blackstone Rangers, which is a gang in Chicago. And Hampton wouldn't take the bait. He wouldn't take the bait on getting into this fight. And I think alarming to state agents who were trying to foster these animosities was the fact that it looked increasingly like Hampton was making inroads with the gangs and was going to be able to bring them into these coalitions as well. And so, it just becomes, I think, it became in the minds of, the Cook County State's attorney, members of the CPD, and, J. Edgar Hoover, it became an untenable situation. And so they targeted a 21-year-old person for assassination.
Wow. It fascinating. Mike, you got a question?
Mike, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks for all this information, Simon. It's really great. It's interesting to look at these situations from a local lens. I tend in my research to look at the federal lens, but how alarmingly similar the police actions are in different cities across the country, and how the reaction, whether by federal law enforcement or state and local, is so similar. But particularly my question will be about the reform efforts, because the way you expressed the reform efforts as well-intended and yet had counterproductive elements, but in any case were short-lived, seems to be repeated over and over again, all the way up to the post George Floyd reforms that, that here these nationwide protests against police violence occurred, and police violence actually increased in the following years to record numbers, right? That it's at some point, do you have to recognize that these intentions are not as benign as we think, or as we want to believe, where, going back to the Kerner Commission or the Christopher Commission in Los Angeles, there are good reforms and that talk specifically about the economic treatment of these communities as the problem, and we have to address these economic situations and other opportunity in these communities, rather than just having a policing approach. But it doesn't seem like those kinds of reforms, they ever get around to them, or if they do so in such a half-hearted way that they don't have an effect.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So I'll say two things. So thinking historically, so when you bring up the Kerner Commission, before you brought up the Kerner Commission, that was actually the first thing that I started thinking about in the course of your question, because you're right. I mean, like the Kerner Commission makes all of these recommendations, describes sort of faces the truth of it says that the United States is moving towards two societies, two unequal societies, whatever it is, one black, one white, sort of belying the fact that by 1968 clearly was already split into two unequal societies. But one of the interesting things about the Kerner Commission report, pursuant to your question, was that one of the members of the Kerner Commission was Kenneth Clark, who was a famous Black psychologist. He was, a prominent figure in the Brown versus Board of Education case. He was the one who authored the famous Dahl test showing the harm of segregation to Black children in the course of Brown. But so he was part of the Kerner Commission report, and he didn't append a dissent necessarily from the Kerner Commission report, but he he offered his own note as a closing comment on the Kerner Commission report, and he basically said in 1968 what you're saying now, where he said that I forget all the various ones that he looked at, but he basically was like, you know, I read the riot reports from 1919, from 1943, from 1965, and he described it as reading all these reports in succession as being a quote Alice in Wonderland moment. He said, you know, it's constantly the same problems, the same reforms, the same inactions, and nothing ever seems to get done. And his basic premise was, what is going to be different this time? And you know, the reality is that, you know, the Kerner Commission obviously, yeah, it did make a ton of recommendations, and almost none of them actually were brought to fruition. And so, yeah, you have these moments of these moments of crisis that seem to exist as moments of potential reform, and then they end up not doing that. And the other thing that I would say too is that just thinking, like taking off my historian's cap and just thinking about my own sort of position as someone who, you know, cares about these things. I was you know, in 2020, like there's a fiction that exists that says that, you know, the defund the police movement in 2020 didn't accomplish anything. Like it did, like it never, like nothing ever got defunded, which is wrong. Hundreds of millions of dollars was stripped from police department budgets in 2020 in response to activist claims, or in response to activist demands. But there were two problems with what happened. The first was that a key element of what defund activists were calling for was not simply stripping, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars away from police budgets, but rather reinvesting those hundreds of millions of dollars into matters of the public good, right? Into job trainings, into anti-poverty programs, into, you know, mental health, you know, pick your pet project, right? Basically saying, like, let's take chunks of this police budget and invest it into things that are, you know, that promote the common good. Overwhelmingly, what happened when municipalities were stripping money out of police budgets was that they were not reinvesting it into these other programs. And so then people could look and say, well, okay, well, we defunded the police to whatever degree, but it didn't actually change anything in terms of community behavior, in terms of crime statistics, in terms of crime patterns or anything like that, which obviously makes sense if you're only doing half of what people are, if you're only doing perhaps the less important half of what activists were actually calling for. And the other piece of that is that in the wake of people saying none of this works, basically municipalities just say, all right, well, let's just go back to how it was, right? And so you have, again, this moment of crisis that appears as a moment of possibility for imagining and pursuing something else. And then it exists in actuality as, you know, within the scope of like a year or so. It just it exists as a return to normalcy. And perhaps more insidiously, it actually, I mean, now if you look in the years since 2020 and 2021, funding for police has only escalated. And so you have not only this moment of crisis that exists perhaps as a moment of possibility, but that actually the way that it plays out is that it plays out as a moment in which crisis turns into a reinforcement and a sort of doubling down on the initial problem that caused this uprising in the first place, right? That caused, you know, that provoked the police murder of George Floyd in the first place, right? And so, yeah, it's really frustrating, but I think that's the general pattern, right? Is that in these moments in which a wedge opens to perhaps do something else, not only are those openings oftentimes foreclosed almost at the outset or just not acted upon in the way that Kenneth Clark was describing, but also that crisis in some cases exists as an opportunity, not just for activists to find something new to pursue, but also for, supporters of more funding for police to do. So I know we're running out of time, so let me just give one more quick example to come back to Porvenir. So in the wake of the Porvenir massacre, the one Latino representative in the state house calls for an investigation into the Texas Rangers. And so the House holds a hearing a year later in 1919. And in this hearing, there's all of this evidence that gets unearthed, not just about misconduct by the Texas Rangers at Porvenir, but also just all this testimony about how the Texas Rangers are, like, a lot of them are just chronically drunk, about how they're just chronically violent, chronically racist. And over the course of these hearings, as you're reading this 1,000-page transcript, the story that begins to unfold is that the rest of the Texas legislature is essentially putting JT Canales, this one Latino representative, basically putting him on trial for wanting to, quote unquote, abolish the Texas Rangers. And he says, I'm not really trying to do that, but, like, we should be thinking about different ways of operating if this is so clearly not working. And then what all of the other members of the Texas legislature who are part of these hearings propose is they just say, well, okay, we acknowledge that, like, the Rangers are kind of out of control sometimes, but what that means is that we should just give them more funding so that they can do better, that they can do things better. And so it's just like, when I was reading this, I was just like, what year am I in? It's just like, but it's sort of like, it's just, it's that old adage that, like, history doesn't repeat, but often rhymes, right?
Right. Yeah, fascinating.
So I think you hit the nail on the head about Hampton. I think one of the biggest things that scared the government was Hampton's ability to bring people together. But one of the things that he had done in Chicago is he brought the gangs as an ally. And he done such a good job at doing that, and also bringing the Latino gangs and even, like you said, the poor white gangs together, that the ability for him being assassinated by one of the gangs was like nil. And so that scared the death out of him when they found out that no one was willing to step up and take that step to assassinate him. But my question is we've been doing this for 5 years, and things repeat itself over and over again, and you've seen it over your history too. What is the playbook? And there is a playbook, and you'd mentioned over patrolling and then under protecting, and there's a playbook that takes down organizations, takes down races, takes down excels its discrimination. Every time something goes wrong with the police force, they get more money. When the police screw up, they get more money. Could you talk about the playbook that we're seeing it over and over and over again, and there's got to be a playbook.
I don't know if there's a playbook so much as there is just. I mean, I'm totally willing to accept that there might be. I guess what I just see constantly is that there's a real lack of imagination amongst people who hold the purse strings within a city like Chicago, or I mean with the federal level, or whatever level you want to look at, in terms of if something is wrong with the police, if they're doing if they're doing things that are wrong, if they're doing things that some of us think are wrong, but other people perhaps don't care about, but they like the response, if the response of the police are doing a quote unquote good job is that, okay, they're doing a good job, we should give them more money so they can do an even better job. And if the police are doing a quote unquote bad job, then the response from those with the purse strings is, okay, well, if they're doing a bad job, we should give them more money so that they can improve. And there is never, like, I wrote a piece for The Guardian about this, I think at the beginning of last year, because like early last year, and this has continued, it showed that like violent crime in the United States had plummeted. And, I wrote a piece that was just like, okay, well, when violent crime was way up in 2020, 2021, we were told that we had to increase funding for police to, in response to this, heightened rate of crime. And now that crime is plummeting, now is it time to like take money away from the police? But it's like, but for like American policymakers just don't think that way, you know, and even like, you know, in Chicago, you know, at this point is, you know, it's the mayor is a pretty progressive Black dude, and who I think means well, but you know, he has not been able to make any sort. I don't even want to say been able to. He has not really made any sort of overtures to try to change that general trajectory of like, you know, rethinking how these systems work. So maybe there is a playbook. I just know that like I chalk it up to a lack of political imagination on the parts of those who actually can control how funding works.
And I know we're almost out of time, but I just have another question I'd like to ask. During all the migrations, the value of those people coming to Chicago were in the early migration was the stockyards. They put them to work in the stockyards. And then later they put them in the factories and so on. And then what we found in the migration, the migrants, those that moved from the south to the north, seemed to do better than those that were already in the north, and actually built their lives up better, had more money in their pockets. And you know, you look at Chicago, the black side of town was popping, you know. So did the progress of the black man have the strongest effect on why they were attacked, or why the things they were singled out and gone after? Was that a part of the?
I think that there is an element of that when it comes to like, you know, competition over resources. I mean, we were talking about like the stockyards and stuff like that. I mean, that, you know, because it's labor competition and things like that. I mean, like the story with Chicago, at least, is that like the police department in Chicago was founded on a repressive mission. It was not founded specifically to target Black people. It was originally, when it was founded, its origins were basically, it was privately funded by some of the big capitalists in Chicago in the middle of the 1800s, who wanted to control the working class, and they wanted to control immigrants from Ireland, from Germany, but like they were, you know, I mean, they weren't as repressive and systematically violent in the way that they were and have been and are towards Black folks. But in that early period, you know, their primary purpose was to protect capital and was to control, you know, these quote unquote undesirable immigrants. And so like part of what I think happened was that as those immigrants over the course of the early 1900s sort of transitioned into just kind of becoming white, just sort of being absorbed into the broader white population, Black folks, especially as they're coming into Chicago in droves during the migrations, they increasingly emerge as like the new kind of other, and that's where the pivot happens for the police department to, you know, I mean, like the police department basically like constantly exists as an extension of broader, you know, xenophobia and racism over the entirety of its existence. And so what has changed over time, in addition to the ferocity of what police can do, and you know, the technologies that they have and all those sorts of things, that stuff changes, but also just who the targets of their vitriol and attention and harassment and violence, like that changes over time. But what does not change is the fact that they have always targeted somebody. It just so happens that, yeah, as Black folks are coming to Chicago, as Black folks, you know, as you said, like a lot of Black folks are ascending into the middle class. I mean, a lot of people obviously are also getting left behind, but you know, a lot of folks are ascending into the middle class. But regardless, I mean, and this unfolds over the course of the 1960s and the early 1970s, where like, you know, during, I guess, especially in the late 60s, early 70s, like there's members of the Black middle class and the Black elite, you know, Black doctors, Black dentists, who, you know, in the early 1970s, don't really have a ton of problems with CPD, because they're just like, well, you know, it's not really our concern. But then in the early 1970s, there's a couple of really high profile incidents where CPD brutalizes or kills like Black professionals and then all of a sudden there's sort of I mean, for lack of a better word, like a come to Jesus moment for even the Black middle class and Black elite, where they're like, this is a institution that is like systematically militating against us. And so I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a long-winded and perhaps tangential answer to your question, but that's the best I got.
Well, thank you so much, and Dr. Balto, we got to have you back when your next book is done. We've got to have you back.
Please, please.
Lots of information today. I appreciate it.
I appreciate y'all.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you next
Thank
time.
y'all.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Pfau Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Tin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crafton provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.